Welcome to the Jack Westin MCAT Podcast with your host, Phil Hawkins.
And Azaii Muniz. Hello. Welcome back to another episode of the Jack Westin MCAT Podcast with your two favorite hosts. We'll pretend that we're your favorite hosts.
Favorite host of this podcast.
Your favorite host of this podcast.
Yeah.
We can still be their favorite hosts in general. Who knows?
Yeah, I'll go with that. Yeah.
So you guys have made it through some of the holiday season, and it might have been smooth sailing for some conflict for others. And so today we're going to be talking about the roles we take on. And before we do that, we want to make a very special announcement. We want your questions. So it's been a while since we've done an Ask Me Anything podcast episode, and we like interacting with y'all, believe it or not. But unfortunately, this format does not lend itself very well to that. And so we want to know what you guys want to know. So send us an email at podcast@jackwestin.com with your questions that you want to hear answered on a podcast episode. Or you can also, if you're listening on Spotify, put the question into the Q&A that shows up with the episode. And then YouTube, leave us a comment. It's a little harder to keep track of those, but we will do our best. So we just wanted to start with that and take advantage of y'all listening as we transition into your role as a student, our role as instructors and friends along this journey of MCAT studying.
Yeah. I feel like we're talking about roles and everyone's probably thinking of Thanksgiving last week and they're like, oh yeah, I had a lot of roles last week. But we're talking about different types of roles, ROLES, not ROLLS. And this is kind of like talking about the roles that we fall into as just kind of people. The MCAT asks a lot of questions about roles, and it's weird because a lot of times students will say that they understand roles, but then when they come across those questions, they struggle with them. So it's one of those things that you want to make sure that you are crystal clear on this and not just like, yeah, you have a rough idea, because the MCAT can be very tricky with these topics. I also like roles are just kind of like, what roles do you fall into? Like a parent, a child, a friend, a sibling, an employee, an employer, right? Like a dog walker. Like what are the different kind of like outfits you fit into, right? Or jobs you fit into, or just roles that you fit into. But a lot of times roles can create issues. And so there's role conflict and role strain. And we're going to talk about both of those. I was actually just reading, oh my gosh, I'm outing myself as I'm a Redditor. I was reading on Reddit, on the MCAT subreddit, because I am there all the time, about somebody who was posting about they felt like their family didn't understand when they were trying to prep for the MCAT, and they're like, their family's just, why don't you just come home like on the weekends? Like it's just one weekend. And like the person's like, oh, then I can't take a practice test this weekend and I have to take a practice test. And like, so what that person's experiencing there is a perfect example of role conflict, which is when you have two roles that don't overlap with each other and they make each other harder. They're in conflict, obviously. And so if you're somebody who really wants to prep for the MCAT, it requires a whole lot of time and effort. And so to be a good MCAT student or a good pre-med student requires a lot of time and effort and work. To be a good family member, that also requires a lot of time and effort and work. And so sometimes you can see the resources, you kind of run out. And so like, how do you make that work? I will say, this is something that if you have not experienced, you will experience. As somebody who wants to become a physician in medical school, I think every student runs into this at some point. I remember myself, I was in a scenario where I was studying for, it's one of my first exams in med school. I was really kind of like nervous because med school was a lot harder than I was expecting. And all of a sudden just kind of like trying to adjust for that. But simultaneously it was that weekend, like my test was on Monday, but that weekend was my mom's 50th birthday. And so I'm like, ooh, I should go to that birthday because that's kind of a big birthday. But I didn't go to school where I lived. And so my family wanted me to travel back. And like, I don't know. I need to be studying for this, but I also want to be there for my mom's birthday. And like, how do I make that work? And like I said, if you have not experienced this now, you will experience it as a physician, as a medical student, because there are some roles that just take up a lot of resources. And it's, when you have too many of those, there just aren't enough of those resources around.
Yeah. And to take a step back for a moment and be really explicit about this, with roles, there are certain expectations that come with them. Sometimes they are societal expectations, right, at a much greater level, and norms associated with particular roles. Sometimes it's more in the, one-on-one interaction level. You're describing that overlap between the expectation that you have for yourself as a student, as a son, and the expectation that other people have. And so when those expectations collide, that role conflict really comes into play and rears its frustrating head. And so to point this out, some of y'all are experiencing this right now. So some of you guys might be full-time students and studying for the MCAT. Some of you might be working a full-time job or a part-time job outside of school. Some folks are parents, others are caregivers. And so things are competing for your time. And that's a very valuable resource that, unfortunately, we never get back. We just get better at managing it when we continue our education. And so it's about finding a balancing act. I want to point out, because you said something really interesting that sent me to a prior podcast episode that we recently recorded, that strain on the resources and the capacity that we have. This is similar to our conversation about primary and secondary groups and how much energy and emotional capacity we have to increase our primary group, right? To keep those really close connections versus those more distant connections. And so you can think about it in a similar way here, where, what resources are needed to complete task 1 for role 1, and resources that are needed to complete task 2 in role 2. But you can imagine a scenario where you don't have enough resources to complete tasks 1, 2, 3, and 4 for one single role. Yeah. And that's where role strain comes into play. There are some roles that are very intense and have a lot of expectations, and you have to wear a lot of different hats. Being a pre-med is one of them, right? Because you have a lot of other roles that are attached to it. And so being a student and getting good grades and a good GPA versus your extracurriculars, things like that, if you're looking at them from as different roles, there's role conflict. But if you're just looking at, okay, being a pre-med and I have to check all these boxes off, that would be role strain. Being a student in general, right? Being able to keep up with the homework that is assigned for that week and also studying for an exam that is that week. I cannot tell you how many times I've gotten frustrated. It's a biostats class that I was taking, and there were assignments due, and new material being covered the week of an exam. So it's like, are we really doing this right now? There is definite role strain going on here. The resources I have to complete all of these tasks, we're cutting it close here. And so this is where there is conflict in role strain, but we have to differentiate it from role strain as a term. And this is, I think, where some of that confusion comes in, because students are like, being a student, there is conflict in here, so that's role conflict. But just being a student would be role strain.
Yeah, that is exactly why it's hard. And it's also tricky because if the AAMC worded things one way or another, that could push the answer to role strain is correct versus role conflict. Like if they said, I have, Susie has trouble taking, struggling with her class load, would that be role strain or role conflict? Well, that would be role strain in that case. Now, if it says Susie struggles with her classwork because her chemistry class has certain expectations, and so as a chemistry student, but also as a biology student, they have different expectations. And so meeting the expectations of multiple, well, that's role conflict all of a sudden, because it's they kind of tell you chemistry student versus biology student, these are two different roles. And they kind of set that up. And so you have to be really careful, because it's very easy to think your way into a thing. You want to make sure that you are the key for me is if it's role conflict, what are the two roles? And are they explicit about what those roles are? I've seen the MCAT do some really tricky, dirty things. Not exactly this, but like something like somebody has, like Phil has trouble meeting his own needs and the needs of somebody else who depends on him. And so is that role conflict or role strain? Now, like meeting the needs of somebody else, like as like a parent, like that's a role. And like, let's say the passage mentions he's a parent, but then it doesn't mention like a role for that self-care. And so I would say personally that there's a role there, and like taking care of yourself as a human, that's a role that everyone should be in. But if the AMC is not explicit about that, if they just say like, as a parent, he has trouble meeting his own needs and the needs of his children, that's role strain, which I know is like a part of me is like very angry about that, because like that seems like it's a conflict, but because they weren't explicit on what's the other role, I can't pick that. And so that's why you have to be really, really critically careful of this, because I think while most students have a good conceptual understanding of this, the application of it, depending on how the AAMC words it, they're going to give you messy situations. And so how do you figure out which one it is? And so I think that that's an important thing overall.
And you can think about some examples of these, in your own life. And one of the really useful things about the psychology psych-social section is that you have plenty of real life examples to pull from to associate with these topics and these concepts to help you improve your understanding and memory of what these topics and concepts are. And so come up with a few examples from your own personal life. Make sure you correctly track if they're a role conflict or role strain. If you're only having one role described, it is role strain. If it is a conflict between two or more roles, then you have role conflict.
Yeah. So another like term associated with this role stuff is master role. This is a role that's kind of all-encompassing, that kind of like sucks you in and tends to overwhelm other roles. Most people have a master role that is like kind of a way that they like the role that kind of defines them. And I don't want to I actually kind of hate saying that, the way that I said, you are not defined by like what your job is and things like that. But when you think about when you meet people, like how do you introduce yourself, right? Like, do I say, hi, my name's Phil, and I really liked Ninja Turtles when I was 6, right? That is a person I am or was, and like that's a role in my life. Like I have feelings about Ninja Turtles because I watched it a lot when I was a kid, but like that's not how I that doesn't kind of define me like in a large aspect or define a large aspect of me. That's probably a better way to say that, rather than define me, but define an aspect of me. I would say a lot of physicians, they're like being a physician is a master role. Like it's something that kind of encompasses a lot, and it explains a lot about who you are as a person, right? Like I'm a doctor, that blah, blah, blah. Because that role takes up so much time and effort, and it tends to overwhelm the other roles where you may be a parent and like, I really want to go to my kid's violin recital, but I got a person dying here on the table and I'm a doctor. And like, sadly, the doctor thing is more important in that one scenario. And so I'm not going to go to the kid's recital. And so it like in some ways, like becoming a physician can overpower even like parent as a role. And like parenting could very easily be a master role for somebody. Like this is the thing that kind of like defines a major aspect of my life. It doesn't have to be a job. It doesn't have to be something like parenting, right? It could be somebody like Lance Armstrong would probably define himself, or like his master role would be a cyclist, like a professional cyclist, or like a professional athlete would probably say as like an athlete is the master role. Like somebody who wants to go to the Olympics, right? And who's like training in gymnastics. I'm a gymnast, right? And that's the role that tends to overwhelm the other roles.
Yeah. And that doesn't have to be static, right? That doesn't have to be permanent. Yeah. And so that's something else to keep in mind. And this is also a source of role conflict, as you're describing, Phil, because it's if the expectations of your master role differ or go against or compete for resources with an expectation from a different role, that will produce role conflict. And it's interesting because knowing that we were going to chat about this today, I tried to figure out what my master role would be. And I don't actually know. It's really weird. But it's something that I've been thinking about because it's useful to understand when you're thinking about priorities and how you want to move forward. Because in that scenario that you gave, the physician might be really uncomfortable with having to miss a recital. And maybe it's not the first time. Maybe it's been a couple of times. And so that's going to impact, recognizing that, okay, physician is not explicitly recognizing this, but, subconsciously recognizing, oh, physician is my master role. How can I make sure that I'm still allocating resources to these other roles? Or maybe how do I switch my master role and make the two more compatible? And so these are things that, like we mentioned before in the psych-soc section, its application is not just limited to the exam. Yeah. There are a lot of different ways that you can apply this in your own life and moving forward.
Yeah, I would definitely say my master role is either nerd or teacher, because that's kind of how a lot of my life is kind of built around that specific.
Yeah. Mine is like a 3-way split. It's daughter/family member, student, and then also teacher. And they're always fighting to see which one's going to be on top, which is why I say, I don't know. They at different points, they take up, in a given week, they might take up different amounts of time, and one gets priority. So it's very interesting.
That seems like you're in a lot of role conflict there.
Oh, yeah.
You're adapting, going back and forth through that. I do also like the fact that you mentioned these can change over time. And so what often leads to this role conflict, especially in the students that I run into, is that they were in a role and expectations were set because of how they acted in that role. As a child, right? How did I, in a family, what was my role in this family? And how did that work? As you go to college, trying to go to med school, right? Doing the MCAT, going to med school, all of a sudden, those roles, especially a med student or pre-med student, those can overwhelm and become a master role, and that changes the resource allocation. I can't do the things I wanted to do before, but those are inherently transient, right? You're not going to be in medical school forever. I want to repeat that for those of you who are in med school, or when you're in med school, you will not be in med school forever. And that will end at some point. But that's going to kind of change things a little bit. And so, I know that this is mostly kind of talking about these terms and how the MCAT is going to test these, but I do think it's a useful thing to be able to talk to your friends and family member about expectations and be listen, I know I've complained about having to study for tests in the past, but this is a little bit different. And I am going to be spending 20, 25, 30 hours a week on top of my regular life in order to study for the MCAT. And I'm just not going to be around as much as I want to be. And I think that's a very important thing to say to someone is I'm not going to be as available as I want to be. I'm not going to be around. Deal with it. But just make it clear to those people that you do want to spend time with them and you do value them, even if you have to make some sacrifices in order to make that happen. But this changing of roles also leads to the fourth and last of the main terms involving roles, which is role exit, which is when you leave a role, right? So if I graduate med school, I'm not a medical student anymore, right? And so you're able to escape that role and kind of change it. That is a kind of a natural, I would say healthy progression. Not that I'm saying being in med school is unhealthy, but you should be leaving there at some point. The role as other roles are a little bit trickier, roles as certain jobs. I would say even a role as a husband and wife, right? I'm a part of a married couple, and that role might end, right? And a divorce or that sort of thing. I think that role exit can be really traumatic to people, especially when the role they're exiting is the master role. I'm outing myself. I'm on Reddit way too much, but there was somebody who posted earlier about they feel like they kind of miss studying for the MCAT because that's how they kind of defined their existence for a while. And not that they love studying for the MCAT, but all of a sudden they don't know who they are. And so it's them leaving that role, which had kind of defined so much of their life for a short period. And I can understand that. I remember when I finished the MCAT, it felt like there was something missing from my life. And like, don't get me wrong, it was in a good way. It's like somebody pulled the knife out of my back that had been there for 6 months. But it felt weird and there's something missing and I don't know how to deal with that. And that is something that can be a little bit tricky. So think about that. Those of you who are studying for the MCAT is like, there's going to be a big transition the day after your MCAT. You're going to wake up and feel real weird.
There are also situations where role exit can be beneficial. So if you imagine a situation where that master role is causing a lot of role conflict with other roles that are very important to you, you may choose to exit that master role. And in that case, you will probably still feel that difference and that change, but it might be for the better. And so when, we don't use these terms when we're making these decisions, but they underlie our decision. So when you're trying to figure out, okay, I have this vying for my time. So maybe you are, on the volleyball team and the track team student, you're in 2 volunteer organizations and you're working a part-time job. You're probably going to decide, okay, I don't have time anymore for all of these. Which of these are most important to me? And which would I have to get rid of or exit the role in order to meet my own and others' expectations in the roles that will be left? And so these are the kinds of things that we do and should be thinking about when we're deciding what we're going to spend our time on and what we're going to stay in. That said, I am ready to exit the role of medical student. You were saying that, Phil, and I was like, I've been at this too long.
Yes.
Taking the year for the MPH has highlighted how much is still left. It's like, I'm so close, just one more year. And then it's so far away because it's another year away.
Yeah. I do want to say, I like that you were kind of pointing out that they can be good. It can also be simultaneously good and uncomfortable and like weird. And I think that that's when a lot of growth occurs in people. You might imagine somebody who like master role is like a physician. And like, I actually know a couple of people who've gone through this that were physicians and then they retired and they they don't know how to define themselves because this thing had kind of engulfed their life. And so they kind of didn't know how to do that. And that kind of creates some kind of weirdness overall. There's a couple of people I knew who were practicing physicians into their 70s and 80s because they just specifically that's what they loved and that's how they defined. And they tried to retire and then they're like, nope, this is not the life I want. I want to go back. And so it's kind of an interesting thing as well. But yeah, go ahead.
No, I was going to chat about some other stuff, but it looks like you
go for it.
So when we're in these roles, we might have formal roles that we take on. So physician is a formal role, student is a formal role, family in some sense, family member is a formal role and that it's quite structured. But we might also informally take on roles in short situations. So imagine that you're in a study group, right? And hopefully you're thinking about what types of groups would apply and what types of relationships would apply based on our last podcast episode. But let's say it's a group of 10 different people. And in that kind of group, in that size, it can be tough to decide, okay, who's going to do what? How are we going to allocate the assignments? And how are we going to figure out who's going to, ask questions or maybe teach one topic or another? And someone might feel comfortable speaking up and informally taking on the role of leader in the group. There wasn't a vote, right? Of, okay, who's going to lead the group? Who's going to make the decision of you take this topic and you take that topic? But people kind of just put these roles on. And the way that we interact with each other in groups, there are other roles, right? You might be someone that serves as a mediator in a group. You might be the person that keeps the team on task or that holds us to timing. And so the person who is very big on taking notes. And so roles don't have to be just the title that you are given for something in society. And all of these can also impact how groups interact with each other and the outcomes of those interactions.
Yeah. Yeah. That's, it's feeling a little real for me with my real life, because I know like there's been some conflict within my family, specifically with, like I am kind of a go with the flow kind of person. And my partner likes to have plans. And so they've kind of naturally fall into that role informally of like being the planner for things. And so I'm just like, I'm okay, I'll go with anything. But they end up kind of planning everything as a result. And so they start to feel this kind of role strain of having to deal with like all of this stuff as managing every aspect of things. And that's just like, I didn't assign that. I didn't ask for that. And she didn't ask for it either. But that's just like kind of falling into an informal role. And that's just, we had a big conversation this morning about like, we need to adjust and change what's going on with this. Sometimes I think just having this language is useful, not just for the MCAT, obviously, but to understand kind of the way people work, which is, I guess, why these terms were made up, not just because they wanted to add things to the MCAT, but because there's actually evidently a use for this. Often, though, like there's some other things that kind of fall within these like groups. And so when people fall into groups, this isn't technically a role thing, but it is worth talking about because it shows up a lot. But group think and group polarization. So group think is whenever you have a group, what happens is the group tends to coalesce around a single idea and give us kind of a single conclusion or something, if there was a question or a task or something like that. For example, like real world, if I were to ask 10 people, like, what's the most important invention in mankind? I'm going to get 10 different answers. Someone's going to say the internet. Somebody's going to say like the cell phone. Someone's going to say the car, the combustion engine, the airplane, like whatever, the refrigerator. And like, yeah. And there's like a bunch of like, oh yeah, like that could be a good idea. But like if I put 10 people in a room together and I said, hey, discuss, what do you guys think is the most important invention? And like eventually somebody's going to say something and everyone's going to be like, ooh, yeah, that makes sense. Like, let's all go with that one. Like language, right? Like I personally, that's my argument, is language is most important, because without language, we can't, like whatever I learn, I can't pass down to the next person or pass to the next person. And so without language, we don't have any of the other ones. But like what'll happen is everyone will kind of come to like an agreement and be like, yeah, that's the thing. And so that group of 10 people, instead of getting 10 different ideas, it's going to give me one idea. That's why also whenever you're brainstorming, it tends to be better to have people brainstorm individually and then come together than brainstorm as a group. But you still kind of want people to come together, because sometimes like somebody will take you like halfway to a great idea, and someone will be like, oh, wait, if you took that and combine it with this, all of a sudden, like that's perfect. But that's something I've seen the MCAT ask about as well, is this idea of like group versus individuals, like how are you going to get more ideas? But this idea of groupthink is people just kind of coalesce or tend to come together in agreement. Group polarization, on the other hand, is a little bit different. This one also requires a group. And this just says that the views of a group will tend to become more extreme over time. Often this happens with two groups. It accelerates it if you have two groups that are in like opposition to each other. So like if I was in a group and a fan club group for Forrest Gump, because we all love Forrest Gump, the movie. And we're like, yeah, Forrest Gump's the greatest Tom Hanks movie. It's so good. We really like it. And then Azaii, let's say you had a group of people that said, oh, Castaway is the best Tom Hanks movie. And like the other ones are good, but Castaway's so good. Like what would happen if group polarization occurred over time? Like fast forward like a couple of years, my group is going to be yelling at Azai's group. And I'm like, Castaway is garbage. It's the worst movie of all time. It should be scraped from the earth. And Forrest Gump is the greatest cinematic masterpiece that ever existed. And all other movies are trash. And like obviously those views have become more extreme, right? First it was just like, I really like Forrest Gump. And now it's like Forrest Gump is the only movie that matters. I think about this group polarization a lot with politics. It's really hard to not connect it to politics, because like in concept, like all the political parties, their goal is to help make America a better place in America. But like, it seems like what's happening is they're yelling at each other like, you're the devil and like, you're the worst. And like, I hate you and you should die. And like that, like things have gotten like so polarized over time where it seems like nobody can kind of work towards a common solution.
And tied with that, and also a little bit tied with roles, actually, is how we respond to signals from other people in a group or from other people in other roles, and how our behavior might change as a result of that. So you can imagine a situation where you are in conflict with, so you're the med student, and you're working with a physician, and there is some kind of conflict about what you should be doing, and the physician tells you should do X. You're going to obey the physician. Obedience takes place here. You're going to do, and you're going to behave in a way that the person who is at a higher power, sounds very philosophical, in a higher position or someone with more power tells you to behave. And so there's kind of that vertical transmission of this is how you should behave.
Yeah. There's
also a scenario where maybe you're in that group of 10 people and y'all are having a conversation and there's some conflict within, and I'm just using conflict because I think it's an easier way to think about this. Mm-hmm. But there's some conflict in that group and they start putting pressure on someone in the group who doesn't agree with them to change their vote, to change their perspective. And so the person who is getting that pressure put on them from their peers or horizontally is going to conform, right? Or rather going to comply. And then conformity is wanting to fit in. And so there are kind of a couple of different terms that apply to situations where we can have conflict. Maybe we don't have conflict and we want to fit in, but they have this connection, can be related to roles, can be related to groups, but don't inherently have to be related to either.
Yeah. The confirmation thing or conforming overall they don't necessarily have to be putting pressure on you either, right? Like if I'm showing up to a group and every week everyone in the group is dressed really nicely, like I might dress up nicely just because I want to fit in, right? Or let's say I'm going to the hospital and all the other guys are wearing shirt and tie and button up, and like shirt and like a blazer. And like, I might just wear that sort of stuff just to kind of like blend in, right? Or maybe I show up in the first couple of weeks wearing a Van Halen hoodie and just kind of like going through that. In which case, then the person above me might come down and be like, hey, there's a dress code. Like, we need to hit the dress code here. And like that, then I change my behavior because of obedience in that case, not because I'm trying to fit in, obviously.
And to be clear, compliance would be the term that's associated with pressure that causes a change. So if other members in the group are putting pressure, that would be compliance with their pressure. Conformity would be what you're describing. You know, I want to fit in. I want to feel comfortable. I want to be considered in the group.
I don't want to seem like an outsider. Yeah. That's something that I think a lot of times people like that's going on a lot and people just kind of don't recognize, right? Like you will act a certain way based on the people you're around. Oh my gosh, we're getting into other MCAT terms like front stage self and impression management and things like that. But so we're not going to get too deep into that, but note that like this actually happens a lot, and really like this idea of obedience versus conforming. Like, are you being told, or are you just trying to fit in? And like, there's kind of a difference between those. We do want to also answer a question. So I know that we were doing a pitch earlier on, like, if you guys have questions, please send it to us. But we had a question that we actually wanted to answer like ASAP, just because the question seemed like particularly relevant. But we talked about this earlier about like making a study plan, pitch to that previous episode. But we had a student ask us essentially, actually, I'll let you, Azaii, I don't know if you want to paraphrase it, because I think you have.
I can definitely paraphrase it, and you can start chiming in. So this student, and part of the reason we also wanted to answer this is this message came in before we decided to do the Ask Us Anything. We wanted to make sure that it got answered in a timely fashion. But basically, they wanted to ask about flashcards after one of our prior podcast episodes. And they're in a situation where they've been studying for a while. And they had tried pre-made flashcards before, but for a couple of different reasons, they're now making their own flashcards, which is something that we talked about, it being a lot more active than passively reviewing someone else's flashcard deck. And so, without doing extra work to make it active. So they're in this situation, but because they've been studying for a while and they don't have their own flashcard deck, some of the topics that they've covered in the past are a little bit fuzzy. And they're not quite as sharp as they used to be, but they're not sure which topics they might need to do extra review on because they haven't seen it for a while or haven't seen them for a while. And they recognize that making their own flashcards would reinforce the material, help them refresh themselves on the material, and help them organize the material as well. But it's a lot of work, and they are continuing their MCAT prep. So should they be pausing their studying in order to go back, make flashcards, some of the topics they don't have notes for, and so they don't have notes to reference in making the flashcard. So what do we do in that scenario?
Yeah, it's a really good question, and it comes down to time management more than anything else, which is something that everybody struggles with on the MCAT because there's too much stuff to do. But I think essentially, for me at least, my first thing is, like, if you feel like I don't trust feelings. I trust data, and everyone who knows me knows this. And it's not other people's. Like, I don't trust my own feelings, right? I look for data everywhere. And so saying, like, I feel like a little bit fuzzy on those topics, I would go and, like, just check, right? Like, do some practice questions on that topic. Like, that's good reinforcing anyway, that's useful. And if you just can't answer some of those questions, maybe go back and build some flashcards on that. But I wouldn't go back and redo stuff just because, like, oh, I didn't, like, I haven't gone that in depth into this in a while. Maybe I should go and spend time on that. I'm like, don't get me wrong. If it's going to take something that's going to take you like an extra hour or 2 hours, and like you can just knock it out on like a Tuesday afternoon, then that's fine. But if it's something that, like, oh, should I pause my prep for 2 weeks while I go back and redo this? And like, that's going to be a bigger commitment. And in that case, I would only do it if you think it's actually going to help. There are some students that their biggest challenge is content, where it's like, I just don't have like the facts and the things down. There's some students that I'm working with right now, and like one student in particular is kind of in that realm. Like their data interpretation is great. They're great at passages, endurance, stamina. It's just those like little facts, especially about like anatomy and physiology. I'm like, okay, let's go back and re-hit anatomy and physiology. So for that student, making a bunch of flashcards on anatomy and physiology absolutely makes sense. But if your problem is the opposite of that, like I'm actually pretty good at retaining knowledge, but my problem is like timing and endurance and stamina and dealing with data interpretation and understanding complex passages and how these things fit together, spending a lot of time making flashcards is not going to help as much with that as much as it would to just do a lot of passages. So it's one of those things that, like, this is why like prepping for the MCAT is tricky and why people get so many pieces of advice and you can't do all the advice, because it's not that the advice is bad, but like the advice from somebody might be what helped them, and it might not be what's going to help you. And so for this student, I would say continue making flashcards as you're going forward, but maybe like get a list of like, what are the things that I think I could go back and do flashcards on? Go just do some practice questions on those topics, and see how you feel about those. And if you're struggling, then maybe take some time to go back and re-hit that.
Yeah, absolutely. So in the past, when I've made flashcards, and now I'm going to talk about something similar, but I find it helpful to, if I'm going to go back in time, so to speak, and create flashcards for material that I haven't covered in a while, to do it parallel to what I'm still covering and to continue making progress on what I'm doing now, rather than completely stopping and saying, okay, I'm not going to look at any more material and I'm just going to go back and write everything I can. Because unless what I'm going back to make flashcards on is something that is necessary to really understand in order to keep moving forward, then there's no reason why I would have to stop. Yeah. And so in a situation with the MCAT, for example, there's no reason to say, oh, I'm going to stop studying chemist or biochem from this section. I'm reviewing some biochem right now. I have to completely stop it and go back and make flashcards for all the chem phys material. Right. It's not necessary, right? Yeah. And so that's something to keep in mind as well. I think it's also helpful when you do have notes to consider. So this student mentioned that they didn't have notes for everything, which suggests that they have notes for some things. Mm-hmm. Consider whether you actually need flashcards in addition to those notes, because you may not need that material in two different formats. So if you've got, let's say that you took some really great notes on enzymes, don't worry about making flashcards on enzymes, because you have notes that you can read, you have notes that you can hand somebody else and have them, you talk out loud and have them make sure that you can check off and say all of the important information. You can cover up on those review sheets and quiz yourself that way. And so there are other ways to engage and to study that aren't just flashcards. So you can do a quick review, a quick skim of that, and then continue making flashcards for other topics. That's something that I'm finding myself doing more of now. So for that biostats and epidemiology class I mentioned, we're allowed to take a cheat sheet on to the exam, which is really nice because there's a lot of equations. And we do a decent amount of coding, and we're not coding on the exam. So we are now doing some math by hand that we otherwise would not be doing. And so what I've found really helpful in that scenario is I started out the semester by making flashcards, and I realized that it was going to get overwhelming very quickly. So in that particular instance, I am making it as I go. And that way I can also, as I'm in the process of making the review sheet, rather than just transferring information onto a flashcard, I'm able to better understand, do I actually understand this concept? And would I be able to apply it, rather than, because now I'm having to decide, where am I placing it on my review sheet? How am I connecting it to? What's it related to? And so that's, in that case, for me, it's taking it a step further from, let me just put this on my flashcard, and is a different way of integrating the material. So something to keep in mind, you can also review these things. And this person mentioned wanting to be able to review on the go and reviewing on your phone. Take a picture of review sheets that you make as well. And you can, take those on the go too.
I'm just laughing because my phone was full of pretty much just pictures of diagrams I'd drawn on whiteboards when I was in med school. That's pretty much all of my photo library was just pictures of whiteboard drawings.
Make sure you can read your own handwriting.
Yeah,
that's an important caveat and an important assumption that we're making when we tell you to make your own review sheets. You can also really quickly store them on a cloud so that they don't take up space on your phone, as long as you'll have internet access wherever you're going to be studying on the go.
I will say overall, I love, oh my gosh, there's so much stuff going on here with these questions that I just want to dive deep into. I would say I really like what you said, don't let it slow you down and stop you, because you don't want to say, I'm going to go back and re-hit stuff. So that means I'm not going to get to these last 8 chapters or ideas that you want to get into. So it might be better to just kind of plow ahead. And then if you have time, take and I would recommend you to do this, do the Jack Westin content diagnostic, which will just tell you what are your weakest areas. Go hit those. And if you have flashcards on them, review those flashcards. If you don't have flashcards, maybe make the flashcards for those. But allowing you to kind of prioritize the things that are actually going to make a noticeable impact on your score. Because it's very easy to put in tons of time and not have it actually move the needle at all. And so I want to make sure that every moment a student is spending is something that's actually going to be helping them, because it is very easy to sink time into something and then not actually get anything out of that. And I definitely don't want that for students.
And super quick, with the Jack Westin Science Content Diagnostic, it is for content. So that, and I want to be really explicit about that, because it's not, you're not going to see it formatted the way you see the general passages formatted, because on test day and on the MCAT, you're going to be tested with connections and using passage information, applying that to what you know, building off of things. Whereas the content diagnostic is, do you know this topic? What you have to have memorized.
Fundamental levels.
Exactly. Fundamental level. And so if you knock that out of the park, don't touch.
Yeah, don't touch
Let it
content.
go.
Fine. Yeah.
And so that's a really great resource because it tells you the kinds of things that are flashcardable, so to speak. Just wanted to explicitly state that.
Yeah, which is why we made that. It's just to like help students diagnose what should I be spending time. All right. Well, I think that takes us through the end of November. I want to welcome everyone to December, which starts tomorrow. But yeah, so like I said, if you guys have other questions, please submit. podcast@jackwestin.com is the best way, but also like the Spotify and YouTube comments, like you can do that as well. But yeah, happy end of November, everybody.